So now video number 3 about the lesson, the assertion of the modern state in France during early modern times. So we are still in part 1, and this video will deal with part 1b, which is about the period of French wars of religion. And my point in this part is to talk about it again, but now with the new approach, which is about the political dimension of the wars of religion. Remember that the topic of this lesson is the building of the state. And so I would like to examine what was the impact of the wars of religion on this process of building the state. Of course, it was one important event. And in the first place, we can say that the wars of religion were a big challenge to king's power. So a brief repetition of the fact. What caused the wars of religion was the emergence of Protestantism in France. It started to happen under the reign of Francis I, and you know from the previous lesson that it was one consequence of the Reformation started by Luther and Calvin. This led to 4 decades of regular civil wars in France between 1562 and 1598. 1562 with the Wassy massacre, where Protestants that were celebrating an office in one of their temples, and one thing I already said in the previous lesson was that the Protestants used to do that in real houses because they did it secretly. So they were killed by Catholic soldiers led by nobles in France that rejected the reform. Well, it started a period during which there was great violence. We mentioned previously St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in 1572 as a moment of great violence against the Protestants. In fact, so what I mean is that the existence of non-Catholic people in France and the existence of wars between Catholics and Protestants was by definition a challenge to the authority of the King of France and to the loyalty of the King of France. Because if French people fight against French people, it basically means that the king does not manage to maintain unity and order in the kingdom. Okay? Which is why what King Charles IX and his successor King Henry III, who was assassinated by the way, they constantly tried and failed to maintain the unity of their subjects during the wars of religion. Okay? It was a failure. So we can say that the French wars of religion were a moment of weak royal power. Because there were 8 wars of religion, because it meant that the areas that were strongly Protestant, well, no area was really strongly Protestant because there was always some Catholics in the area, but Protestants were rather important in the south of France and in the west, south of Nantes, okay, near La Rochelle, it meant that the rule of the king was not obeyed the same way everywhere, and that sometimes violence burst out, which means the king was failing to maintain peace inside the kingdom. Only King Henry IV managed to bring unity back. We already talked about that. In a previous lesson we said that Henry was a Protestant. He did not belong exactly to the same family as his predecessors, but as Henry III had no child, King Henry, his cousin, became King of France. He was a Protestant at that moment. And so in order to be sacred King of France, to receive the crown, he accepted to convert back to Catholicism. And he made this Edict of Nantes in 1598, which permitted to the Protestants to live in France and have their religion. It's what we call freedom of conscience. They were tolerated and protected by the states, who used to call them Huguenots, even though the kingdom remained officially Catholic. So if we consider now the Edict of Nantes as a very important political act, it is a very important political act because it is a way for the king to restore peace and unity in the kingdom, to find a strategy to have a united kingdom with Protestants and Catholics, even though the people don't have the same religion. So that's a very clever political strategy. And when I said that the Protestants were protected, it notably meant that some cities were directly administrated by Protestant power, and that the Protestants had some place de sûreté, which means some places where they could organize militarily to defend themselves against Catholic attacks if they happened to be. So that was a way to put an end to wars of religions. Anyway, as a conclusion to this rather short part, but why not some short chapters from time to time, it is important to note that the reign of Henry IV is known to be a moment of strengthening of the king's power. It means that the king's power got stronger. And more than this, it is remembered as the beginnings, the very beginnings of absolutism, of a moment when, the king really increased his authority in France. At least we can say that Henry IV tried to do that, and for a long time succeeded. As you may know, he did not succeed completely because religious tensions remained high, and the king was eventually assassinated by a Catholic monk named Ravaillac in 1610. One or two remarks. Have a quick look at the painting on the left. It shows Henry IV with his good face, which may be a bit deceptive. Sometimes we have very great remembrances of Henry IV when in fact he was also a king that wanted to fight a new war in Europe. And when Ravaillac killed him in 1610, that's just a remark, but when Ravaillac killed him, maybe Ravaillac prevented Europe from being at war again, because King Henry wanted to attack Spain. So maybe he saved lives, Ravaillac, in a way. Anyway, King Henry here is represented with a blue coat with the fleur-de-lis on it, and he has the crown and the royal scepter, the royal stick in his hand, showing his power. He also has a sword showing his military power. And here you have many elements that we will see on other images. Quick remark about the painting showing the assassination of Henry. This is how we believe the murder happened, in a street in Paris, in the royal car that was attacked by Ravaillac. What I want to say is that this painting was done much later. It's a painting of the 19th century. That is maybe exaggerating the action of the scene a little bit. Anyway. One last thing about the assassination of King Henry IV. So if we summarize, we can say that during this century, the 16th century mostly, there was a reinforcement of king's power, then a big challenge to king power during the wars of religion. And in fact, many of the Protestants, they were were princes that, a bit like what we said for Europe, sometimes you became a Protestant more for political reasons because you wanted to annoy the Catholic power, which was also true in France. In any way, Henry IV managed to restore king's power in France. And he was assassinated. Maybe not directly for that, but his assassination is something that would be remembered by his successors, who knew that it was now the Bourbon family at the head of France. The successors knew that they had to reinforce the authority of the absolute king, and they were determined to do so. And they also knew that they would have to deal with opponents to this increasing of their authority. And this would lead to events that I will examine in later videos.